The baby's cries tore through the cabin like a verdict, relentless in accusing 3 hours into the flight. Mothers pressed hands to their mouths, children whimpered, and grown men stared in fury. Passengers glared as though the shriek belonged to them. Mothers softened not for comfort but for sheer outrage, and one man finally snapped, hollering, "Tell that kid to shut up." The father, slipping beneath the weight of power and privilege, stared down tears, his expensive suit drenched in sweat, his empire offering no defense against this raw, human breakdown. And then, from the back rows, a scrawny teenager who should have stayed invisible rose. What happened next would rewrite how everyone on that plane, rich or poor, understood desperation, difference, and grace. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this boy? A teenager sitting in the last row wearing clothes too small for his thin frame, a backpack tucked under his seat like it held his whole world. His name? Few on that flight cared enough to ask. But the moment he stood up, heads turned, eyes followed, and a hush swept over the aisle like a sudden storm. Why was he on the same flight as Charles Whitmore, one of America's wealthiest men? A billionaire who owned skyscrapers, shipping lines, and oil fields. A man whose presence alone demanded silence and respect. Yet here he was, red-faced, his baby wailing uncontrollably in his arms, stripped of all authority, every eye upon him. And behind him, this boy. And how did a single act, in the middle of the sky, rewrite the destiny of two families from completely different worlds? What happened at 35,000 feet would not remain on that plane. It would ripple outward, shaking lives and legacies no one thought could ever meet. Darnell Carter was 17 years old, a boy from Atlanta, Georgia, who lived in a world where every dollar had to stretch further than it could. Raised by a single mother, a woman who juggled 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, Darnell learned early that dreams were fragile things easily broken by bills and empty refrigerators. Yet he carried something rare within him, a gift. While other kids drowned their time in distractions, Darnell found himself drawn to a chessboard, moving pawns and knights like pieces of destiny. His mind worked in ways that stunned teachers, and by 13, he was already beating men twice his age in local parks. Still, talent could only take him so far when the world demanded proof. Tournaments and travel money he did not have. But this flight? It wasn't just about leaving home. It was his one chance to step into a room where opportunity was waiting, and where, perhaps for the first time, people would finally see him. Yet Darnell's strength wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply personal. His younger sister had been born sickly, a baby whose cries rattled the walls of their small apartment, night after night, when their mother was too exhausted to continue. Doctors had names for her condition, but no real solutions. Darnell, still a child himself, took the role of protector and caregiver. He discovered small tricks, rhythms, and sounds that seemed to calm her when nothing else would. Where adults failed, his patience and quiet observation worked. That memory, the long nights of pacing, whispering, humming, etched itself into him. So when he boarded the plane to New York, his mind was fixed on chess and competition. But hidden inside him was a skill no one expected him to need, least of all on a flight 35,000 feet in the air. Meanwhile, in the front of the plane, Richard Caldwell occupied a very different seat and a very different life. 52 years old, he was the embodiment of American wealth and power. The CEO of Caldwell Industries, his signature alone could move markets. His name was known in boardrooms across Wall Street, and his fortune measured in billions. He was feared by competitors, admired by some, despised by others, but always respected. Yet, for all his dominance in the world of business, Richard Caldwell carried a private wound. Just 6 months earlier, his wife Margaret had passed away suddenly, leaving him not only bereft of the one person who softened his edges, but also the sole caretaker of their 6-month-old daughter, Emily. A baby girl too young to understand loss, yet already carrying its weight in the form of endless tears. Richard had wealth enough to hire the best nannies, assistants, and staff. But on this flight, he was alone. No team, no entourage, just him and his crying child in first class. And as Emily wailed endlessly, Richard found himself stripped of the power that usually defined him. In the sterile cabin air, surrounded by glaring passengers who cared nothing for his billions, Richard Caldwell was reduced to something far simpler: a father in crisis. The businessman who once controlled empires could not control his own child's tears. And in this moment of collapse, fate prepared to bring him face to face with a boy from Atlanta. A boy no one expected. A boy who carried no wealth, no status, but something Richard desperately needed. Two men, two worlds. One struggling for survival, the other drowning in wealth. Both about to collide in the most unlikely way. The trouble began minutes after takeoff. At first the sound was faint, muffled against the hum of the engines, but it soon grew sharper, more piercing, until every passenger in first class could hear it: the cries of 6-month-old Emily Caldwell. Her father, Richard Caldwell, accustomed to silencing opponents in boardrooms with nothing more than his presence, found himself utterly powerless against the relentless wails of his own child. He tried everything: bottles prepared with precision, tiny toys shaken with desperation, pacing the aisle with stiff movements that betrayed his discomfort. But nothing worked. Emily's cries rose above them all, raw and uncontrollable, bouncing off leather seats and polished walls until they filled every corner of the cabin like a storm no one could escape. At first, passengers exchanged polite glances, a silent language of shared discomfort. But as minutes stretched into an hour, tolerance eroded. Mutters grew louder, sighs turned into sharp complaints, and disgusted looks cut through Richard like knives. One man finally shouted across the cabin, his voice heavy with anger, "I paid $8,000 for this seat. Control your kid." Gasps followed, but no one defended Richard. The billionaire who once commanded silence with a word now stood red-faced and humiliated, reduced to pleading with his daughter in whispers that carried no authority. Even the flight attendants, trained to maintain calm, showed cracks in their composure. They hovered nearby, offering suggestions, but behind their professional smiles, their frustration was clear. They too were powerless. Meanwhile, in economy, a young man sat listening to every cry. Darnell Carter closed his eyes, the sound dragging him backward in time, to long nights in a cramped Atlanta apartment where his little sister's cries once rattled him awake. He remembered pacing the floor with her in his arms, humming softly, discovering rhythms and patterns no doctor had taught him. He knew that sound, the desperation of a baby needing comfort, and he knew instinctively that he could help. But the thought of leaving his seat filled him with hesitation. He was 17, a boy in second-hand clothes, headed to New York not for luxury but for a chance at survival. And to step forward, into first class, the world of Richard Caldwell, and the furious men who demanded silence, was more than just a walk up the aisle. It was walking straight into a wall of prejudice. Darnell unbuckled his seatbelt. The motion was small, almost unnoticeable, but inside him it was monumental. Each step forward was heavy with risk. Passengers turned their heads as he reached the curtain dividing the classes, eyes narrowing, questioning. And just as he prepared to cross the invisible line that separated wealth from struggle, a uniformed hand stopped him. A flight attendant, firm but not unkind, whispered urgently, "Sir, you can't go up there." And in that moment everything hung in balance: the cries of a baby, the pride of a billionaire, and the courage of a boy who dared to believe he could make a difference. The cries did not stop. They cut through the air, unrelenting, until Richard Caldwell, once a fortress of control, began to crumble. His suit was wrinkled, his hands trembling, his voice cracked as he finally broke down. He stood in the aisle, sweat on his brow, and shouted words no one expected to hear from a man worth billions. "I'll pay anyone who can help my baby." The cabin froze. The anger, the mutters, the whispered complaints all dissolved into silence. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended. And then from the rear of the plane, a voice answered. It was steady, young, and certain. "Sir, I think I can help." Heads turned, faces twisted. The sight of Darnell Carter stepping forward, a teenager in a faded hoodie and worn shoes, was met not with gratitude but with sneers. Some passengers whispered under their breath, sharp words soaked in prejudice. To them, he did not belong here, not in this aisle, not holding the attention of a billionaire. Richard Caldwell stared at him. His mind, sharp in business, was clouded by hesitation. He saw the boy's clothes, the skin that marked him as someone from another world, another struggle. Doubt battled with desperation. Could this boy possibly do what a man with every resource could not? The baby's cries pierced through the silence again, louder, sharper, almost as though demanding a choice. And Richard, stripped of every other option, handed over his daughter. The weight of Emily passed from billionaire to boy, a moment so charged that every eye in the cabin seemed to burn into them both. Some passengers waited for disaster, convinced this was a mistake. Others quietly prayed for a miracle. Darnell Carter cradled Emily with practiced hands. His movements were not clumsy, not uncertain. They were measured, gentle, born of nights long past. He shifted her small frame against his chest, whispered something only she could hear, and began to hum. It wasn't a song, not in the way most would recognize. It was a rhythm, a sound drawn from memory, a tone he had once used to soothe his sister through endless nights of colic. His thumb pressed lightly against pressure points on her tiny hands. His palm rubbed circles along her back, movements no manual had ever taught but his own experience had carved into instinct, and slowly, impossibly, the impossible happened. Emily's cries began to soften. Her tiny breaths shifted from frantic gasps to steady rhythms, her fists unclenched, her body melted into calm, until finally she slept. The cabin exhaled as one. Relief swept across rows of angry passengers now silenced by awe. Shock etched itself into their faces as they watched a 17-year-old boy succeed where wealth, status, and countless attempts had failed. A hush blanketed the space once filled with wails, and for the first time since takeoff, peace settled in the air. Richard Caldwell's eyes never left his daughter. He leaned closer, voice breaking into a whisper meant only for the boy holding his world. "Who are you?" For a moment, first class was silent, every passenger unsure of what they had just witnessed. Richard Caldwell, still shaken, studied the boy who had done what he himself could not. After a long pause, he gestured to the empty seat beside him. It was an invitation that carried weight not just across the aisle but across worlds. Darnell Carter hesitated, glancing at the glares of those who believed he had no place there. But Richard's hand remained steady, and so Darnell crossed the line fully, taking a seat in first class, the baby still calm in his arms. What followed was not a transaction of wealth or privilege, it was a conversation, rare and raw, between two lives that should never have met. Richard leaned forward, his voice quieter now, stripped of the armor of authority. He asked the boy where he was from, what brought him onto this flight. Darnell spoke plainly, without dramatics. He told Richard about Atlanta, about his mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. He explained how chess had become his refuge, his dream, and how this flight to New York was not about luxury, but about opportunity. He had been invited to compete in a tournament that could open the door to scholarships, his only chance to rewrite the story of his family's life. As he spoke, Richard listened, not with the ears of a businessman weighing profits, but as a father desperate to understand something larger than himself. And then, in a moment few could have imagined, Richard Caldwell opened up. He spoke of Margaret, his wife who had passed away only 6 months earlier, leaving behind a silence in his home that no fortune could fill. He admitted with a tremor in his voice that he did not know how to raise Emily alone. "I built an empire," he said, his words hanging heavy in the still air. "But I can't even soothe my own child." The confession was not meant for the cabin nor the world, but for the boy beside him, the boy who, moments earlier, had done what he could not. Darnell's reply was quiet, almost tender. He looked at the billionaire and said, Sometimes love doesn't need money, sir. It just needs patience. The words struck Richard harder than any loss in business, harder than the fury of passengers, harder even than the sound of his daughter's cries. Here was a boy with nothing, no wealth, no security, teaching him a lesson worth more than his billions. And in that fragile moment, Richard Caldwell was not a CEO, not a titan of industry, but simply a father who had just been humbled by wisdom from the most unexpected teacher. When the wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac in New York, the cabin filled with the usual rush of movement, seatbelts unfastened, overhead bins thrown open, passengers eager to escape the long confinement of the sky. Darnell Carter, who had returned Emily safely to her father's arms, slipped back into his economy seat with little fanfare. To him, what he had done was not extraordinary. It was simply instinct, the same instinct he had once used to soothe his little sister when no one else could. He gathered his small backpack, careful not to draw attention, ready to disappear into the noise of the city and focus on the tournament that meant everything. But Richard Caldwell was not about to let him vanish. As the passengers filed out, Richard stood in the aisle, holding Emily, and called after him. For a man accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms, his voice now carried something far rarer: gratitude. In front of strangers who only hours before had sneered at the boy, Richard publicly thanked Darnell. He did not whisper, he did not hide. He extended his hand, and with it, a business card engraved with his name. "Call me after your match," Richard said firmly. "Let's talk about your future." The cabin fell silent for a moment as eyes turned toward the exchange. Some looked shocked, others ashamed of the doubt they had cast earlier. Darnell left the airport not with money, not with promises, but with something far more powerful: a chance. That evening, at the tournament hall in New York, the boy from Atlanta took his seat across from his first opponent. His nerves trembled, but his focus sharpened. Piece by piece, move by move, he played with the same quiet patience he had shown on the plane. When victory came, the applause was louder than he expected, but nothing compared to what awaited outside. News of what had happened in the skies had spread. Headlines told the story in bold print. "Poor teen helps billionaire's baby and gets more than thanks." Richard Caldwell, true to his word, followed through. He did not simply offer a handshake or a fleeting gesture. He took action. Within weeks, he had arranged sponsorship for Darnell's education, ensuring that tuition, travel, and training would never again be barriers. The boy who once worried if his family could afford the bus fare to tournaments now had the backing to pursue his dream of becoming a grandmaster. For Richard, it was not charity. It was recognition of something he had nearly forgotten: that greatness is not measured only in wealth but in heart, in resilience, and in the courage to step forward when no one else dares. And so, two lives, one forged in poverty, the other in privilege, intertwined forever. A father who thought money could solve every problem discovered that sometimes the answer lies in compassion. And a boy who once believed his world was small found it suddenly expanded. Not because of luck, but because kindness had finally been seen for the power it holds. In a world where money buys silence, it was kindness that bought a voice. Two lives forever changed, one by desperation, the other by compassion. Would you have trusted him with your baby? Think about that moment. Richard Caldwell, a billionaire used to controlling every aspect of his world, handing over his fragile 6-month-old daughter Emily, not to a doctor, not to a nanny, but to a 17-year-old boy from Atlanta, Darnell Carter. Some passengers doubted him, some mocked him, yet it was Darnell's steady hands and patient heart that brought calm when money and power had failed. And so we ask you, in that moment, what do you believe mattered more, money or heart? Was it Richard's wealth that saved Emily? Or Darnell's compassion, born from nights spent soothing his little sister, long before anyone knew his name? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Share your perspective, because every answer tells us something about who we are and what we value. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the smallest act can rewrite the largest destiny, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because the next story we share may change how you see the world forever.